flows from our effectiveness, not the other way around, and continue working with the European Parliament even closer than we have. This can make a difference. Dear colleagues, if I don't see you again, all the best for the elections, I hope that even unofficially we will continue in the next months discussing my mandate and my work and your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Stavros. We will continue until April. We have a full agenda in our Human Rights Committee, and we will inform you how far we have come. And you can be assured, as soon as the elections are over, the DRA committee will be on your door and prepare the next legislation. So thank you again for coming. And I now ask the experts on West Papua to come up, and we start with the hearing on human rights in West Papua.
So, we start. I will continue in Polish language, and you are ready to translation. Rozpoczynamy.
So we are going to start our next point, which is a hearing concerning the human rights situation in West Papua in Indonesia. I'd like to welcome all of you, all the present. We have a strong representation here at the table. Our guests, our experts who are going to present the results of the studies, the experience, which is very often difficult experience. Indonesia and the European Union are important partners. In 2009 an agreement, a cooperation agreement was signed, the so-called BCA agreement. It is the first agreement of this kind between the European Union and an ASEAN member. From 2010, the European Union has a regular dialogue with Indonesia concerning human rights, and the last meeting, dialogue meeting, took place on 15th of November last year in Brussels. Our previous guest, Commissioner Lambridinis, visited Jakarta in May 2013. Papua is the western part of the New Guinea island from 1969. It has been recognized internationally as the part of the Republic of Indonesia. In 2001, it has received a special status, autonomous status within the Republic of Indonesia, but in the opinion of many observers, this autonomous status it was not enough to respond to the main political needs and economic needs which are expressed by the local population of West Papua. Those major problems cover many challenges. It is the distribution of income, which is generated from exploitation of natural resources, which are this province is rich in copper and gold, but also the exploitation of forest. There is oil and gas. Another problem or important element of this discussion is the debate on the discussion on autonomy or independence, or marginalization, sidelining of the ethnic Papua's population. The inflow of Muslim Indonesians to this region, which was initially Christian, to religious tension between the ethnic population and the Muslim migrants. Also, the demographic balance changes as the result of all of this, and there is a risk that the local ethnic population will become a minority on their own territory, both in the area of culture and religion. Situation concerning human rights is especially difficult. There are elements of discrimination in education or health issues, economic discrimination. There are limits on expression, and political activities are always qualified or seen as people who would like to see that part of Indonesia become independent, as separatists, which leads to accusation, to criminal accusation or deprivation of liberty. There are also accounts concerning breach of human rights by security forces. We have information on the use of torture and other problems. At least 25 people were murdered between October 2011 and March 2013. This is the result of the research carried out by the European Parliament and its agents. There is no clear responsibility ascribed to those who are using torture, and torture is not mentioned in the criminal code, which results in the culture of impunity. For the right to carry out a review of this situation, in order to carry out a discussion of these topics which I have listed, and which result from the information that reaches the European Parliament. For this reason, we have invited 3 guest speakers, but 2 of these speakers have come from Indonesia. During the debate, I would like to give the floor, according to our internal regulation, to the Ambassador of Indonesia, Arif Havas Oregano, who is present here, and the representative of the EEAS, Mr. McSweeney. So I'd like to present our guests. Madame Zeli Aryan, she is coordinator of the National Papua Solidarity It's a group which was established in 2013. Its task is to build society, to build solidarity within the Indonesian society. Most of the activists who have founded National Papua Solidarity were dealing with human rights issues already in the past, as well with environmental issues. This organization covers the students' movement in Papua. It is about solidarity with those who are on strike. This organization's response to the need for better organization of the civic society in Jakarta to influence the government, its position, which are sometimes defined as the position of Jakarta. Madame Zell is also dealing with women's rights within the organization Free Women, which is also working in Jakarta. We'd like to ask you to talk about the rights of the ethnic population of Papua and relations with the migrants moving to Jakarta. This means access to land, right to education, health service. We'll also ask you to discuss the approach of the Jakarta to the situation in Papua and the dialogue between the ethnic population and the government. Our second guest is Mr. Norman Voss, who represents the Human Rights and Peace for Papua. It is an international alliance of social and religious organizations for Papua and network for Western Papua. Mr. Voss monitors the human rights situation in Papua and the situation of churches. This population demands peaceful solution of conflicts. It's an organization grouping many other associations. It promotes its work in Europe and at the European Union and United Nations. Until 2012, Mr. Voss was working for the Asian Human Rights Commission, verifying breaches of law and the legal system. He studied in Aberdeen and his MA on International Public Affairs in Hong Kong. Our guest is going to discuss the problem of torture, murder, arrest, situation of political prisoners, violence or impunity, and difficulty for the access of this information to representation at the United Nations. Victor Mambo is our third guest. He represents the Alliance of Independent Journalists, the West Papua division. Welcome. He is the head of the Papua division of Alliance of Independent Journalists. He monitors the situation of independent media in Papua, and he's a journalist of Tabloid Jubi, an independent Papuan journal. He's a redactor-in-chief of that journal. He is also a correspondent of Al Jazeera for West Papua and a coordinator of a campaign, Protect the People and Forest of Papua. That's the name of the campaign. He was also a consultant of the World Bank during the projects implemented by the International Labour Organization and other organizations. He monitors and documents the issues of human rights. He was taking part in many trainings and seminars for journalists who are dealing with documenting human rights situation. Mr. Victor Mambo is going to present information concerning the situation of journalists in Papua, and he's also going to discuss the problem of murders of journalists and relations between the Papua journalists and the central government. That includes the limitation of access to foreign journalists. Because of the pressure of time, I would like to propose to make a presentation within 7 minutes maximally, and after that I'm going to open a round of questions for the MEPs, and then I'm going to give the floor to our guests from the EEAS and the ambassador of Indonesia. At the same time, I would like to signal that Posel Donskis is present here, who proposed putting this item on the agenda of our committee. So I would like to stress this because he's present here. So now I would like to give the floor to Madame Zeli Ariane. I would like to ask you to make a presentation within the time provided. Over to you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, and good day for everyone, and especially Indonesian ambassador to Uni Eropa. I speak on behalf of Indonesian civil society living outside Papua, who are very disappointed for Indonesian government approach to Papua. I have to say to Indonesian government's representative here that we cannot lie to ourselves any longer for the state of human rights violation in Papua. We have to admit it. And I have to ask the DROI Committee of European Parliament for your attention of the situation in Papua. Democratization in Indonesia is praised by the world, but we should know that after 15 years of Indonesian reform, there is no fundamental change on approach by the government to deal with the Papuan issues, especially on civil and political rights. Military deployment and repression coined during the Suharto dictatorship in order to crush pro-independence groups and to secure corporate power is continuing without real civilian control. A peaceful dialogue as a means to negotiate and to find solution and compromise, as proclaimed by President Yudhoyono in 2010, and also he repeated in 2011, and proposed by many stakeholders in Papua, is less and less popular within Jakarta's administration. For Jakarta, dealing with injustice and poverty in Papua is to eradicate often arbitrarily labeled pro-independence groups and dividing civil society through intelligence operations, dividing administrative regions against the law and the consent of the Papuan people, and pouring in money that spurs corruption and benefits mostly elites and transmigrants. Jakarta's approach to Papua so far is widely considered as having failed due to its lack of participatory design and the focus on elitist economic and rights aspects. Jakarta's approach to Papua today has failed and should be evaluated. The approach is closely tied to the old development paradigm of seeing Papua people as enemy rather than family. Do not merely blame Papuan elites for the failure of development in Papua. There is also need to evaluate the policies itself and the way central government seeing Papua. The implementation of Special Autonomy Law number 21, year 2001, and the division of the Papuan provinces through Presidential Decree number 1, 2003, have worsened the Papua-Jakarta relations. Without any participatory evaluations of the current policies, the government has formed the Unit for the Acceleration of Development in Papua and West Papua, or UP4B, in 2011, and later agreed to the suggestions of Lukas Nmb, Papua Governor, to Special Autonomy Plus 2013, which merely means the expansion of the governor's authority. Democratic rights and participation are lacking in this process. A solution to the conflict and violation in Papua can only be sustainable if it's drafted in consultations with the majority of the people, civil society organizations, religious and indigenous groups and leaders, legal provincial bodies such as MRP and DPRP. Until today, Papua comprises the resources richest provinces, but shows the highest poverty rates and the lowest human development index of the country. Jakarta claims that addressing the economic problem through infrastructure, health and education sector development would sufficiently address the grievances of Papuans. But however, the uncontrolled inflow of development project funds in the widely military-controlled province has only spurred corruption and widened the gap between rich and poor. But all eyes are on eastern part of Indonesia nowadays, especially Papua, and Papua is the star. More investment are expected to go there through the latest economic investment scheme, the Master Plan for Acceleration and Expansions of Indonesian Economic Development, or MP3EI. The European Union is Indonesia's fourth largest trading partner after Japan, China and Singapore, and as the second largest investor in Indonesian economy, is likely one of them, maybe. And for that, we need to push Indonesian government to have more political openness. Openness in the market economy should be followed by openness in political approach to conflict. Dialogue is very much still irrelevant, since it's never started. EU support and pressure for dialogue is important, and in the meantime, military deployment should be evaluated and monitored. Special UN rapporteur should be able to pay visit. Human rights defenders and journalists should be protected. Political prisoners should be freed, and ones who got very sick and mentally ill are priority. And the right to assemble and organize protest actions should be guaranteed, like in other parts of Indonesia. Jakarta is in a position of no or low interest to the proposed Jakarta-Papua dialogue for, I think, two reasons. The framework of NKRI, or Indonesian unity, not being negotiable, and an increasing climate hostile to human rights highlighted by the absence of fair investigation and trial to any human rights violation cases. I think Munir, the famous human rights violation cases, is the best examples of this backward approach. Wamena and Wasio human rights violations are the two examples of investigated cases of gross human rights violation by National Human Rights Commission in Indonesia, but is in a deadlock with the Attorney General. These are indicators to see the possible change of approach by the central government to Papua. Even though President Yudhoyono has in the past promised his support for a dialogue, these statements have so far not substantiated to a process that Papuans see progressing. A growing international concern for the situation in Papua was voiced at the Universal Periodic Report, or UPR, in 2012, and from the Pacific nations to the Melanesian Spearhead Groups, or MSG. It is therefore important to continue encouraging the central government side to honor its commitments and to show a visible progress in resolving the conflict peacefully in light of the upcoming national election between April and August 2014. An end to human rights violations are the precondition to a peaceful and sustainable land of the conflict and in Papua that continue to cause the suffering of the civilians. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam. Next speaker, Ms. Norman Voss, Human Rights and Peace for Papua organization.
Thank you. West Papua is a place marked by fear, violence, military presence, isolation, and a high level of social disparity. The exploitation of natural resources, usually without the free, prior and informed consent of local communities, and the ongoing influx of non-Papuan settlers result in a marginalization of indigenous Papuans, who now make up less than 50% of the population. A high deployment of military personnel and special police forces in this civil conflict frequently results in extrajudicial killings, torture and arbitrary arrests. Independence activists are being targeted. Last month, the Asian Human Rights Commission reported about the death of West Papuan independence activist Danny Kogoya in Vanimo, Papua New Guinea on December 15. In 2012, he had fled to the neighboring country, like many other political activists, fearing arrest, torture or being killed in Indonesia. In Papua New Guinea, Danny received medical treatment for his right leg, which had been amputated without his consent in Papua, Indonesia, 3 months earlier, after he had been shot by Indonesian security forces during his arrest on September 2, 2012. The cause of death in Papua New Guinea was reported to be liver failure due to the presence of unusual chemical substances in his body. A Vanimo court classified his death as a case of murder and called for an autopsy. The autopsy was later prevented due to intervention by Indonesian state authorities, raising suspicions of their involvement in Danny Kogoya's death through poisoning. Between October 2011 and March last year, Papuan human rights organizations have documented more than 25 extrajudicial killings in Papua. Military raids in villages in remote areas lead to more frustration and resentment among Papuans. After 2 members of military battalion 756 had crashed with a motorcycle into a Papuan child in the highlands on June 6, 2012, people who witnessed the incident became angry, knowing that reliable accountability procedures against military personnel are non-existent. They attacked the soldiers, causing the death of one and serious injuries of the other one. In retaliation, 2 trucks of armed personnel of that battalion raided the village, killing Elinus Yoman and injuring many other villagers. The military burned 64 buildings, several vehicles, and killed pigs. Military forces injured 12 civilians who had to be admitted to the public hospital in Wamena for medical treatment. Torture by police is frequently reported. On Thursday, September 26, 2013, Nahor Stefanos Yalak was arbitrarily arrested by police officers and taken to the police station in Waina, Papua province, where 2 officers and 2 members of the military tortured Nahor for 1 hour, including stepping with heavy boots on different parts of his body and whipping the victim with a cable. He was then transferred to the police district office Abepura, where he was detained and from where he was released the following day. As a result of this torture, he was unable to chew due to the swellings, had bleedings and bruises, and was hardly able to walk. Indigenous Papuans are regularly arrested and detained for peaceful actions. For example, for raising the Papuan Morning Star flag or attending demonstrations and public events critical of the government or expressing independence aspirations. If convicted, they can face lengthy prison sentences, and police are also increasingly charging activists and demonstrators with possessions of weapons under an emergency law if they are found to possess a penknife or other tools of daily life in West Papua. In May 2013, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, issued an unprecedented statement condemning the ongoing suppression of freedom of expression in West Papua. At least 70 political prisoners were serving sentences in Papuan jails in December 2013. We call on this Parliament to urge the government of Indonesia to release all political prisoners. The Papuans Behind Bars project notes that political arrests in 2013 have more than doubled as compared to 2012. 29 persons were charged with conspiracy or incitement to commit treason in 2013, as compared to 2 persons in 2012. 112 political arrests were reported in November 2013. Indigenous Papuans have suffered for more than 50 years from violence by Indonesian security forces. For example, the Asian Human Rights Commission had published a report on the mass killings of thousands of Papuans during military operations against civilians in the Papuan highlands between 1977 and 1978. For this case, the Commission sees the criteria of genocide being fulfilled and calls for truth-building and accountability in respect of the victims and survivors. Civil society urges the Indonesian government to end the cycle of violence, impunity and conflict in Papua by ensuring the protection of human rights defenders from threats and intimidations, and by ensuring that perpetrators in the military and police are held criminally accountable according to international norms. Indonesia needs to provide access for UN human rights mechanisms. We call on the EU to urge the Indonesian government to provide free access to the UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of expression and opinion to Papua. During the 2012 Universal Periodic Review of Indonesia at the UN Human Rights Council, Indonesia had agreed to invite him, but in January 2013 postponed his visit indefinitely. UN mechanisms, foreign journalists, diplomats, foreign human rights NGOs, and other independent observers face serious access restrictions or are not allowed to enter the region or to meet with civil society there. Through this Jakarta-run isolation approach, the work of civil society for indigenous peoples and their rights and human rights is often prevented and seriously limited. This conflict needs dialogue. We call on the EU to support President Yudhoyono's pledges to hold a dialogue with Papua. Churches and other peace activists in Papua and Jakarta have been calling for years for a peaceful dialogue under neutral mediation between hardliners on both sides. Jakarta shows reluctance while violations continue and conflict tensions are escalating. Papua needs to be opened up and international human rights norms be realized for Papuans. A peaceful and sustainable change cannot be expected in a climate of fear and repression of political dissent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gross. And next speaker, Mr. Victor Mambor. Have you 7 minutes, sir? Okay.
Thank you. The biggest tragedy is when the state buries freedom of the press. No democratic country can be without freedom of the press. Generally, freedom of the press as a fundamental aspect of freedom of expression in Indonesia varies in different circumstances. In Jakarta, the law number 14 of 1999 on the regarding media and press as well as citizens can use that law consistently in many parts of Indonesia. Journalists, mass media and the public can benefit from the press law. However, media and civil society in Papua cannot get the benefits from this law. In the last 3 years, the Alliance of Independent Journalists, Jayapura, documented that intimidation and violence against journalists and mass media there increased significantly. 7 cases on 2011, 12 cases on 2012, and 22 cases in 2013. Murder and attempted murder against journalists occurred twice in the last 5 years. In 2010, Ardian Samatrais, tabloid Jubi journalist, was killed by drowning to the river after he published an investigative report on illegal logging. During the efforts by Aji Jayapura to conduct investigation with the police to find the perpetrators of this murder, the family had asked Aji Jayapura to stop the investigation. Ardiansa family admitted later that they received daily threats by a group of unidentified men to coerce the family to have the criminal investigation stopped. In the end, the police concluded that case with approval of the family that the cause of the journalist's death is suicide, not a murder. On 3rd of March 2011, Banjir Ambarita, the Jakarta Globe journalist, was stabbed by an unknown person in Jayapura. The investigation carried out by Aji Jayapura indicated that the stabbing is related to an article he wrote about sexual harassment by a police officer against a female prisoner in the Jayapura police station. Aji Jayapura repeatedly asked the Papuan police to investigate the stabbing case until its completion. But the Papuan police took no action and never delivered the results till now. So we urge this committee to push for a full investigation of all cases of violence against journalists in Indonesia and to end impunity for the perpetrators of this case, such as Udin case in Yogyakarta and Banjir Ambarita case in Jayapura. We also see that different standards are applied by state to local media in Papua and the media outside Papua. Media outside Papua is free to show the Papuan Morning Star flag, a symbol for Papuan identity, while local media in Papua faces serious repercussions and is questioned by security forces. In the case of the Pelita magazine, police banned the issue in 2013. This confirmed to us of all that this double standard still prevails in Papua. According to human rights activist and journalist Andreas Harsono, official document leaked in 2011 indicated that Indonesian military employs around 2,000 Indonesian Papuan-based journalists as informers, raising doubts about their reporting. The military has also financed and trained journalists and bloggers. This field reporting related to Papua with distorting information through social media and bloggers. The governor of Papua had in September 2013 made a statement of invitation to foreign journalists and international organizations to enter Papua and alleged that there were no restrictions in place. The reality for access application looks different. While the provincial Papuan government does indeed not cause any access restrictions, and the raising of the issue by the governor is being appreciated, that authority to issue such access permits is not in local Papua hands, but in those of the national government through the clearinghouse procedure in Jakarta. The difficult application procedure for foreign journalists is an important issue that should be addressed here. For more than 25 years, foreign journalists have to apply to the Department of Foreign Affairs for travel permits, giving information about who they will interview, when and where. Their application is then considered as so-called clearing horse meeting involving of 18 Indonesian government departments, including the intelligence body, police and military. Most applications for serious reporting are rejected. Even diplomats accredited to Indonesia must seek permission from the Department of Foreign Affairs to visit the region. The clearinghouse process remains the only legal road to West Papua for journalists, foreign journalists as confirmed by Fairfax Media with the Indonesian Department of Foreign Affairs. Journalists who travel without permission face being put on a blacklist, banning them from future visits to Indonesia. and correspondents living in Indonesia have to face the risk of having their immigration permit be revoked. AJI also reported that head of police of Papua province alleged in an interview with the national media that foreign journalists and researchers will be part of foreign intelligence activities, and this would be an effective disguise for intelligence operation. It gives a concerning picture about the authorities' perspective about the foreign journalists. AJI Jayapura also noted that intimidation and violence by police officers against journalists is increasing every year. Although higher-ranking police officers have a good understanding of the function and role of the press, lower-ranking police personnel doesn't have a sufficient understanding of the function and work of the press. This has led to acts of intimidation and violence by the police against journalists, which are increasing every year. The clearinghouse procedure that affects foreign journalists as well as other independent observers has to be stopped, as it is violating press freedom. Therefore, I call on this Parliament to urge the Indonesian government to allow free access for foreign journalists, as this would also protect the work of local journalists. And the UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of expression and opinion should be given access to Papua as a priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Teraz otwieram dyskusję dla Państwa posłów. Mamy zgłoszenia.
Now I'd like to open the discussion. Pastor Donskis will be the first to take the floor. But I would like to ask you, we only have 20 minutes until the end of our session. And the representative of the external service and the ambassador will take the floor, so we don't have too much time. Mr. Donskis, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I deeply appreciate this discussion, and I do believe that in our subcommittee it was quite extraordinary to have this debate, this hearing on human rights in West Papua, Indonesia. So, and I have to say that in fact it's a very important case, because all over the world we have some societies which in many cases are multicultural, quite complex, and at the same time they could be very successful on their way to the whole package of modernity with respect for human rights and with adoption of higher standards in our political practices. And yet there are some sensitive issues remaining. And I do believe that what's happening in Indonesia is something that could lead to a very important dialogue in terms of how to approach West Papua, how to approach, is it something that calls for serious debate about the problems related to separatism, or is it more about sensitivity, sensibility, respect for human rights, and avoiding double standards in treating every culture and every community and every society? So that's why I think that at least what we need here is a relativization of this problem. Any kind of relativism suggesting that it's lack of understanding or the application of two mutually exclusive vocabularies or lack of cultural dialogue. In fact, it's about politics. It's about a political application of standards and political application of rules that we believe in. And least that I would like to have here, what I would like to avoid is any kind of replacement or any kind of confusion of terms, trying to come up with cultural debate or cultural reflections instead of political solution. So that's why I think that we're debating something deeply political here instead of something that could be relegated to the margins as cultural dialogue or something like that. So it's a deeply political problem, and I'm delighted that we started this debate, and I need that it comes as a very important addition to our package of human rights violations and human rights problems. Thank you.
Madam Gomez.
Yes, I would like to say, being the rapporteur of the report that the Foreign Affairs Committee adopted this week on giving the consent to the PCA Partnership and Cooperation Agreement between the EU and Indonesia. that we have there a very useful framework to address the kind of problems that this hearing is highlighting. I was struck by the statements, namely by the two Indonesian citizens who testified, Ms. Ariane and Mr. Mambo, because their testimonies are indeed a demonstration that how much things have dramatically changed in Indonesia. They are freely here speaking out. I was in Indonesia a couple of months ago collecting elements for my report, and I spoke with many activists of human rights in Indonesia who are doing fantastic work in bringing out all the problems like those that were evocated. And it's really quite a change, because I remember the first time I set my foot in Indonesia in 1999, nobody talked even about Papua. The word Papua was proscribed. People talked about Irian Jaya. It was the official name of Papua. And now today everybody talks about Papua. It tells a lot how things have indeed progressed, how these important statements coming from Indonesia were present here openly. But of course it also shows that there is a lot to be done. And I agree that there are many problems, namely educational problems, indeed cultural problems, because of course there is a specificity, a cultural specificity to Papua that is indeed a tremendous wealth of Indonesia that should be preserved as wealth of Indonesia. But I cannot ignore that, as it has said, that there is high military deployment, control, that is geared into securing corporate power in logging, illegal and legal, but as well in mining, that do not benefit the people of Papua as it should. And that, of course, we know there are problems of corruption. We in the Parliament, we know, for instance, here, in the framework of the report we approved here in this, and we elaborated here on human rights and corruption, we are moving forward enacting the so-called Magnitsky Act, which is not just about Russia. It's about exactly situations where probably in Papua it will be easy to identify some people who are particularly responsible for corruption in human rights. And I recall in Indonesia it works. I recall that Generals Wiranto and Prabowo never more set foot in the United States or in Europe because of fear of being brought to court or arrested because of human rights violations in the past in other places. So I believe, nevertheless, that, as it has been said, dialogue is the most important thing. And this is where, indeed, our PCA can be a very important tool. There is a human rights dialogue already started in the framework of this PCA. It should not be something abstract. It should exactly tackle the kind of problems that the Indonesian civil society identifies as problems. And that the Indonesian government as well, and our government and our people identify, because obviously it's a two-way street. It's also a framework to address human rights problems in Europe as well. I believe, I was struck, recently we had the chair of the Indonesian First Committee, Komisi Satu in the DPR, the Parliament of Indonesia, Pak Mahfuz Siddiq here, in meeting with the members who were shadowing and myself, the other report in AFET, and he was very keen to work. He highlighted that indeed there was work to be done on Papua inside the DPR. And he was the one who actually proposed that we would use this PCA to actually go for some kind of joint work on that with our parliament, with the Indonesian parliament, eventually even organising a joint visit, recommendations and so on. So I think that indeed the partnership and cooperation agreement provides us with a very important tool to work together with our Indonesian partners, government and civil society, in tackling the kind of problems that have been evocated here, and that are indeed serious problems because eventually they fuel conflict, which is obviously the last thing that any country, and in particular Indonesia, needs.
Thank you very much, Madam Gomez. And I have one more speaker, but very short, okay?
You can be sure I will be very short. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank all the speakers for their contribution to this hearing. If you don't mind, I have a few remarks and questions in my own language, which is Dutch, so if you don't mind. Ik ben zelf...
I used to be a professional journalist myself. So, like colleagues, I was impressed by what I've heard regarding the way journalists are being dealt with in Papua. I've never been to your country when I was working as a professional journalist, but I have been to many other locations in the world, and I'm very well aware that having a free press is vital if you want a successful democracy. The persecution of journalists, such as is occurring in your country, always sends out the signal that there's something fundamentally wrong. There's something very basically wrong in terms of the implementation of human rights. I'm extremely concerned about this, and above all, I would like to hear from the authorities, we have the embassy represented here, what they have to tell us and what they envisage doing about this situation. Secondly, I'm also a keen proponent of the right to self-determination, and I can quite understand that if a region such as West Papua is marginalised in this way, for economic reasons or whatever other reasons it may be, a desire for self-determination has become very strong. And I give my full backing to that. My question to the people from Papua is this. Is it the case that the majority of the people in West Papua see a possible future within the Indonesian state? Autonomy can take various forms, after all. You may talk in terms of independence, or you might think in terms of a federal or a confederal system. Autonomy can go hand in hand with cooperation, and it needn't be construed as any threat to the Indonesian state as such. Do you think, then, that some form of autonomy within Indonesia is conceivable, with some real autonomy? Would the Indonesian authorities be open to such a possibility? Is there any dialogue with that prospect in view? And I'd like to address that from both angles, both that of the indigenous people of West Papua and the Indonesian authorities.
The speaker. Next speaker, Mr. Morgan McSweeney. Yes. 3 minutes, sir, okay?
Thank you, Chair. The promotion and protection of human rights remains a key priority of the EU's foreign affairs and security policy. Overall, Indonesia is a human rights success story. Decentralization and specific peace initiatives have helped to reduce the problems of 15 years ago dramatically. Today, Indonesia is arguably the freest and most democratic country in Southeast Asia, with a powerful and active parliament and a vibrant and dynamic civil society. Its transition from dictatorship to democracy is hailed as a model for the region and even for the Arab world. There is much that Indonesia and the EU share, starting with a strong commitment to democratic values enshrined in the PCA. We appreciate Indonesia's strategic role in the region, its work on peace and stability in Myanmar and developing a code of conduct for the South China Sea, as well as its role in ASEAN. We also recognize Indonesia's efforts to promote democracy and human rights in the region and beyond through initiatives such as the Bali Democracy Forum. Turning now to the case of Papua, there is admittedly a lot to be done, as Ana Gomez has correctly pointed out. But let me say at the outset that we recognize firstly the sensitivity of Papua for Indonesia, and our basic position is quite clear. We respect the territorial integrity of Indonesia, and we regard the provinces of Papua and West Papua as being an integral part of Indonesia. On the number of specific human rights concerns that we've heard today, namely freedom of expression, treatment of prisoners, accountability for human rights violations, we in the EAS have equally raised them consistently through our annual human rights dialogue, 4 of which have been held to date. I would like to commend the Indonesian side for the manner in which it approaches the dialogue. The dialogue is an opportunity to raise respective questions of each other. As Ana Gomez very smartly put it, it's a two-way street. We've asked questions of each other, and we have done so repeatedly in the case of Papua. For example, we have equally heard reports of crackdown on demonstrations, as well as attacks, though, on Indonesian security officials by armed groups. In this regard, we should note that it is often difficult, if not impossible, to verify reports of human rights violations. And in this regard, we have strongly encouraged Indonesia to allow precisely for greater access for journalists and civil society organizations, precisely to avoid any misunderstandings. We also understand that the central government has promised to conduct inquiries into alleged abuses by the security forces. This is a constructive course of action. We equally understand that there are discussions between Jakarta and church leaders, the Indonesian Institute of Sciences, LIPI, and government representatives, which is also an encouraging sign and one that we support. Overall, the EU supports the Indonesian central government's efforts to boost development in Papua and West Papua, and we hope to see it enjoy the same level of peace, stability, and prosperity as the other parts of the country. In particular, the EU supports projects in health and education sector, as well as on climate change. Overall, the EU has been a major donor in Indonesia over the last 20 years and has provided support in various sectors, including in the areas of justice and governance. The range of areas of bilateral cooperation has included trade, development, and political cooperation. Finally, we believe that the Indonesian government is genuinely committed to addressing the problems in Papua and improving the economic well-being of the population, in spite of the political difficulties. And we very much hope that these efforts will bear fruit. Thank you, Chair.
Next speaker, Mr. Ambassador Ogroseno. 3 minutes, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all thank AFET that voted 2 days ago to recommend the framework agreement between Indonesia and PCA to be ratified by the European Parliament. Currently, all 27 national parliaments of EU member states have ratified PCA. The ratification of PCA by the European Parliament will surely take the relations between Indonesia and the EU into a new level of relationship based on principle of equality, shared values, and mutual benefit. The PCA also reaffirms the respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity of Indonesia. This year will be particularly important for us because we are going to go into general parliamentary election in April and presidential elections in July. These are regular, direct, free, and fair elections. There will be around 186 million voters. This is a substantial increase since the last elections, and we hope that the level of participation remains the same, which is 70%. Mr. Chairman, last December 2013, the Indonesian Parliament debated on further decentralizations in Indonesia, and it has decided, among others, to put forward draft laws on 22 new regencies, including 7 new regencies in Papua. Since 1999 until today, there are 2 provinces, 40 regencies, and 2 mayoralties in Papua and West Papua. For over 3 decades before that, there were only 1 province, 9 regencies, and 1 mayoralty. When political reform started in 1999, upon having dialogue with 100 Papuan leaders, President Habibie put into motion the enlargement of Irian Jaya province previously into 3 provinces. The plan was not materialized because of strong opposition. Then President Wahid changed the name of Irian Jaya province to Papua to recognize cultural identity. 2002, people of West Papua themselves proposed to President Megawati to restart the process of establishing the West Papuan province. It is important to underline that the establishment of those new provinces, new regencies and mayoralties are founded upon laws that were debated through democratic processes by Indonesian parliament that is also democratically elected. As a matter of fact, law on special autonomy 2001 was drafted by Papuan leaders and academics themselves. This decentralization is part of national process of strengthening autonomy and local government across the nations. Under those laws, the leadership of those new autonomous regional governments in Papua and West Papua has to be Papuans. The regional parliaments in Papua and West Papua also needs to be Papuans. Furthermore, the traditional cultural rights of Papuans are also recognized and given special place in the society. Within the current setup, 80% of revenue from forestry, fisheries and general mining stay in Papua. 70% of oil and gas revenue is also stay in Papua. Other provinces, they enjoy only 15% of oil revenue stay in their own region. Now, poverty remains high, true, around 25% by early 2013. However, the trend has been continuously declining as the World Bank recorded the poverty in Papua was 54% in 1999. This number represents national trend in Indonesia, where the poverty rate in 2000 of all Indonesia was 48%, and today is 11%. Now, Mr. Chairman, to say that nothing changes since the last 15 years is rather misleading. We, the government, believe that the dialogue, as you can see from all previous presidents since 1999, have established Papuan policy that move away from security approach to prosperity approach, facilitate Papuans to manage their own affairs through wide-ranging autonomy. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, we face multiple challenges of complex development matters, whereby we are doing those at the same time with separatist attacks. Now, this is where EU is balancing policy of addressing development issue and separatism at the same time. Europol, in its report, in the annual report of terrorism situation and trend report, revealed that in 2012 there were 167 attacks of separatism in EU, and EU authorities have arrested 257 individuals for the separatist attacks. Now, we would like to learn more from the European Union on how you balance national development matters and also security issues that hopefully we can work together through the framework that we have agreed in the PCA. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie ambasadorze.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We do not have more time because the interpreters will have to finish their work quite soon, and I am obliged to give our guest the opportunity to respond.
Participants did this.
1 minute.
One minute. Madam.
Yeah, I would again stress on my arguments about nothing fundamentally changed in 15 years Indonesian democracy in Papua. Because when I say it's fundamental change, it means that an approach and also a support on the civil and freedom of expression in Papua. We can have more money, more development project in Papua, but without democracy, we don't know what happened. I think that is the only way to know whether the development approach to Papua is really succeed or supported by the people. Without democracy, without the freedom of saying whether it's wrong or not, we don't know. Indonesian government can say this, and peoples in Papua can say different things. So I think what we mean by fundamental change is really the guarantee on democracy, the guarantee to gathering, guarantee to have a say, freedom of expression and things like that. Related to the there is money goes to education and health care facility as the important element in development of Indonesia, for example. We can say that the recent 2 cases in 2013 in April, since November 2012, there has been more than 543 people who died in Tambrau district, for example. It still happened until now in Yahukimo district. So I think that's for example. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to respond to the split up of provinces and regions. It is indeed the case that the number of administrative regions have increased a lot to a proportion with population in them that is unreasonable in the Indonesian context. On Java you have regions with hundreds of thousands or millions of people in one, and in Papua you have provinces with smaller and smaller populations of tens of thousands or some thousands. Basically you create a well-paid high administrative elite in a context where rule of law is absent and corruption is growing. Looking back at the history and the understanding of Papuans, their relation to Indonesia, we have to acknowledge that according to different reports, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Papuans were killed over the last 50 years. And as long as this is not acknowledged and this is not respected, it will be difficult for Papuans to feel that the Indonesian government is really supporting them, is respecting their dignity, is holding perpetrators accountable. So that's the question in an autonomy situation. Is it possible to hold perpetrators consistently accountable? Is it possible that Papuans have access to rule of law and their own resources? Is it possible to hold the murderers of human rights defender Munir, who was killed in 2004 in Jakarta, not a Papuan case, accountable? So far not. And ultimately, is it possible to keep military interests out of public life, out of economy, and out of democratic politics? Thank you.
And Mr. Mambo, 1 minute.
Thank you. I really agree with Mr. who, I don't know his name, but from EAS, that when we want to fair report about West Papua, we need to allow foreign journalists to visit, to enter West Papua. And for the special autonomy law, I think the special autonomy is the best solution. It's the way solution for West Papua and Indonesia. But the problem is not about the law. The problem is how the government of Indonesia and the West Papua government implemented this law. Because the law is good, but the benefit is not come to West Papuan people. Yeah? For example, in the law, the military commander and also the head of police, when they want to, and Indonesian put them in the West Papua, it should be discussed with the government, with the governor, but it's never happened. It's not happened till now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to apologize all of you for my dictatorship style of chairing this meeting and restricting your time. I would be happy to listen to all your comments, including also our panelists and the representatives of EAS and the ambassador, as well as our colleagues, MEPs, because the topic is especially intriguing and important, in my opinion. Important for us, but above all, important for West Papua and important for Indonesia. As a representative of a country that went through the difficult process of transition, I can tell you that what is of key importance is building trust. Without building confidence and trust, it is difficult to see a true recovery or remake of relations between the civil society and the government. It is a very difficult process which requires compromises on all sides. It is not true that the representatives of the government do not have good intentions. I think that the PCA is also a symbol of changes that are occurring in Indonesia as well. I think that that agreement is an example that testifies to that, but sometimes the soul-searching from the past is burdensome, and what people have in their minds and hearts is very often as important as the economic progress that we are observing. I would like to wish our guests from West Papua that their aspirations and wishes come true, and I'd like to wish also for Indonesia to be able to come to terms with that difficult process. I think this is our common wish on behalf of the Subcommittee on Human Rights. It's definitely not our last discussion, however it will be difficult to continue during this term of office. I'd like to thank our guests, panellists, representatives of the Commission and EEAS, the Ambassador and interpreters. I'm sorry for prolonging your work a little bit. Thank you.
12 and 30 February. Thank you.